New this morning, after being shut out of Friday's big summit in Alaska, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky announced a short time ago that he will be coming to the United States on Monday to meet with President Trump. Zelensky had a one-on-one call with Trump and then with European leaders as Trump was traveling home from Alaska. Trump also spoke with NATO leaders, according to his press secretary. Zelensky wrote on social media that, quote, Ukraine reaffirms its readiness to work with maximum effort to achieve peace, adding, we support President Trump's proposal for a trilateral meeting between Ukraine, the USA, and Russia. While President Trump wrote on his own social media just a short time ago that a peace agreement, not a ceasefire, is the best way to end the war. It comes after Trump's summit Friday with Russian President Vladimir Putin, ending with no announcement of a ceasefire in Ukraine. During brief remarks after his meeting with Putin, Trump admitted he didn't get much from Friday's sit-down.
I believe we had a very productive meeting. There were many, many points that we agreed on, most of them, I would say, a couple of big ones that we haven't quite gotten there, but we've made some headway. So there's no deal until there's a deal.
As for President Putin, he got a literal red carpet welcome from the American president for his first visit to the U.S. in a decade, and a chummy, smiling ride with no aides present in the president's armored limousine known as the Beast. And no sign of the serious consequences President Trump warned of before the meeting. NBC News White House correspondent Vaughn Hilliard joins us now. Vaughn, good morning. First and foremost, as you've been talking to folks in the White House, how are they feeling about this? Because the pictures of some of them as they were walking into the room where the remarks happened, they didn't look so as excited as Vladimir Putin did.
No, I messaged one official particular after the press conference that the two men held in which President Trump spoke for just over 3 minutes, and I asked for insight and reaction, and it was, quote, not yet. That's not typically the response that comes after events of this magnitude. And I think it's notable because of the lack of specifics that folks outside of President Trump, Secretary Marco Rubio, and Steve Witkoff, who sat in that room for 3 hours with Vladimir Putin, have about the substance of the conversation between the two sides. For more than 3 hours, there were back and forth, and President Trump, upon leaving Alaska last night in an interview on Fox with Sean Hannity, he was asked about the specifics. Of course, there was conversations potentially about the swapping of territorial land. That's what President Trump had previewed. But the president did not give any indications and did not go into specifics, and he said maybe somebody would. Perhaps that would be Vladimir Putin himself. And that is where we saw the European allies, as well as Volodymyr Zelensky, wait with bated breath for that phone call from the president, which he did execute on in the midnight hour upon his return from Alaska. And that's where Zelensky said that in his one-on-one hour phone call with President Trump, he said that he felt positive about the direction of it and was hopeful that there would be a trilateral conversation, meaning one that took place, a meeting between Putin, Trump, and Zelensky. And in the statement, I think it's important, worth noting, he said, quote, in my conversation with President Trump, I said that sanctions must be strengthened if there is no trilateral meeting or if Russia evades an honest end to the war. Sanctions are an effective tool. Security must be reliably and long-term guaranteed with the participation of both Europe and the United States. And so it begs the question here for President Trump this weekend before Zelensky comes into town, exactly what did he indicate to President Putin that he would take to President Zelensky as a potential peace deal? Because it was initially set up that this meeting would be a demand for a ceasefire. That did not take place, and instead you heard President Trump say from that podium yesterday that President Putin wants to end the killings as much as he does. It's worth noting that more than 70,000 Ukrainians have been killed, soldiers and civilians, at the hands of Russians in this 3.5-year war led by President Putin. Guys.
NBC's Vaughn Hilliard from the White House, thank you so much. Let's bring in Richard Haass, President Emeritus of the Council on Foreign Relations. He is the author of the weekly newsletter Home and Away. And Celeste Wallander, who was responsible for Europe, NATO, Russia, and Ukraine as Assistant Secretary of Defense in the Biden administration. She is also Executive Director of Penn Washington. Folks, thank you for joining us this morning. I want to start with a statement right in from President Zelensky, brand new. We probably don't even have a full screen for it just yet. yet, where he says the positions are clear. We must achieve a real and lasting peace, not just another pause between Russian invasions. The killings must stop as soon as possible. The fire must cease both on the battlefield and in the skies, as well as against our port infrastructure. All Ukrainian prisoners of war and civilians must be freed, and the children abducted by Russia must be returned. Thousands of our people are still held in captivity, and all of them must come home. Richard, that seems like an outline for what he wants in some kind of deal as we move forward and kind of try to figure out, as these, this just happened really hours ago, how the rest of the world has taken all this in.
My reaction to that is that it's unrealistic. It's useful to distinguish between ceasefire or cessation of hostilities on one hand, peace on the other. Peace is asking an awful lot of both sides, and they're not ready for it. Peace means you agree to give up certain claims. You'd give up this on territory.
Parts of land, yeah.
Whatever, population movements. Neither side is even in that zip code. A ceasefire, a cessation of hostilities may not sound ambitious. Trust me, it's ambitious after 3.5 years of this phase of the war. And I actually think that's one of the mistakes of U.S. diplomacy. By introducing certain issues that would be part of peace talks, what in the Middle East we call final status issues, it's too much. It overloads the circuits. What you want is as simple and as clean as a ceasefire. May not sound like much. Trust me, it's a lot. It doesn't ask anyone to give up their long-term goals. You maybe have a separation of forces. It doesn't prevent, by the way, a restart to the war. It's one of the reasons that in all of this, and it hasn't been talked about a lot, what has to be decided by Donald Trump is what is long-term U.S. policy towards Ukraine. What kind of support are we going to give? What kind of help for them, pressure on the Russians? This doesn't take place, shall we say, in a vacuum. Diplomacy always takes place in a context.
Celeste, help me square this circle here. I'm going to play what President Trump had to say to Sean Hannity on Fox. This is after the meeting with President Putin. Watch this.
No, I'd rather not. I guess somebody's going to go public with it. They'll figure it out. But no, I don't want to do that. I want to see if we can get it done. It's not a done deal at all. But it's up to President Zelensky. I think we are, and if they'd like, I'll be at that next meeting. They're going to set up a meeting now between President Zelensky and President Putin. And myself, I guess, I didn't ask you about it. Not that I want to be there, but I want to make sure it gets done.
Okay, I wanted to play that, Celeste, because President Trump is putting all of the pressure on President Zelensky here. He is the one. It's up to him. Now, let me read you this from this man by the name of Miroshnik, who serves as the Russian Foreign Ministry's ambassador at large for the Kyiv regime's war crimes. It says here, as a leader of Ukraine, as he calls himself, Zelensky is unacceptable. He cannot sign anything. So how is a ceasefire or even a peace deal going to be possible when the Russians do not view President Zelensky as legitimate? And the president of the United States is saying it is up to the guy the Russians say is illegitimate to come up with a deal.
Well, thanks so much for setting that up so well. And I think you've done a great job of showing how difficult and complicated the situation is, as Richard also laid out extremely well. From the beginning, the stakes for Putin are not controlling territory in Ukraine. Controlling territory is instrumental to controlling the political leadership in Kyiv, having influence over Ukraine's foreign policy, security, and economy. And that is why they are talking about the illegitimacy of Zelensky, because one of the demands that Russia has made for a peace settlement is to be able to hold new elections with Russian influence, of course, in those elections, so that Putin's desired leader, the one he can work with to control Ukraine, is actually the president of Ukraine. So as Richard noted, there is so much distance between an acceptable peace settlement that at most what you could achieve is a ceasefire. And the reason you did not see any progress on a ceasefire in the discussions in Alaska is that Putin doesn't want a ceasefire because Putin believes that he is winning on the ground. That is the reason for these strategic attacks on Ukrainian critical infrastructure, on cities, on civilians, as well as on the front lines of the battle. So Ukraine is ready for a ceasefire. Zelensky has said he's ready for a comprehensive or even partial ceasefire. But Putin's trying to change the game by talking about a final settlement that he knows is a long way off. He's buying time. And meanwhile, he gained legitimacy and he broke out of the isolation that the international community had put on him 11 years ago, the first time that Russia invaded Ukraine.
Richard, the thing that I think is striking us and also all the people around the world who are waking up to all of this news and trying to figure out what happened here is that Putin just a few years ago, just yesterday, 2 days ago, was a pariah, right? Most European leaders had not spoken to him in a very long time since he invaded Ukraine. But this NBC article that we have up today with this breaking news, Putin rehabilitated by reception in Alaska, and that's according to a German lawmaker. The quote is, "There is no ceasefire and there are no serious consequences," Roderick Kaisweider of the center-right CDU party told German broadcaster ARD today. Instead, Kaisweider said the summit allowed Presidents Putin and Trump to appear on the world stage as equals and said Putin's red carpet reception of Putin was in blatant contradiction to the reception given to Zelensky at the White House. I assume that's Trump's red carpet reception of Putin there. He got a ride in the beast, which doesn't happen that often. He got this flyover, all these beautiful pictures, Donald Trump smiling and shaking his hand. He got to talk first during the remarks and last. What did the United States get out of this?
We'll just take a step back. The idea of having a summit with Vladimir Putin, given everything you've talked about, it should have been made conditional.
Yeah.
To me, one of the most surprising things of Alaska was how unconditional the entire thing was. You're right. Putin not just was, but is a pariah.
Yeah.
The attacks continue. The war crimes continue.
While they were meeting, it appears.
Absolutely. So to give him an unconditional reception seems to me wrong. This all should have been wired, which is my larger point.
Yeah.
The idea that the American officials seem surprised and disappointed. Look, I've worked for several presidents. I worked for 4 years at the White House for George Bush the father. The idea that a president would go to a summit only to be surprised, these ought to be the most wired interactions. There were almost nothing left for uncertainty.
Lots of conversations that happened beforehand, the president just putting a bow on it.
Exactly. 99% of it ought to be wired. Now, not a guarantee, but wired. This seems to me to have been just the opposite. And I don't know if Putin misled the United States, if the envoy, Steve Witkoff, simply got played. I don't know if Donald Trump simply was so cocky that he thought the power of his personality could bring Putin around. But the idea that you would have had Putin come, essentially get literally and figuratively the red carpet, and have virtually nothing result from it, and then the president leaves saying, so now it's up to Zelensky. It just seems to me something is wrong here with how this was handled diplomatically, how this was handled. The foreign policy craft, if you will, of this seems sorely lacking.
A summit that was put together in like 7 days. Usually they take months and months.
So can we just talk about the Allies' response? And we've heard lots of negative comments. Eugene read some from German officials. I want to put up this statement from UK Prime Minister Starmer on the meeting. It says, President Trump's efforts have brought us closer than ever before to ending Russia's illegal war in Ukraine. His leadership in pursuit of an end to the killing should be commended. While progress has been made, the next step must be further talks involving President Zelensky. The path to peace in Ukraine cannot be decided without him. We've already talked about the role of Zelensky, but I'm just wondering why. Can we talk about using Prime Minister Starmer's statement there and sort of the praise at the top of President Trump? How are European leaders viewing what President Trump did yesterday?
So Europeans, I think, are breathing a sigh of relief. They don't, they're not happy that there were the optics that there was this breakout from isolation of Putin. But they were working in a very, very clear, coordinated way to prevent significant damage from the meeting. That is the reason why they met with Zelensky ahead of time, why they coordinated discussions with President Trump ahead of time, and now they managed to get a conversation afterwards. Think of the Europeans right now as our major disaster management and prevention team working with Zelensky to prevent the United States from taking really bad steps. And the Europeans are doing a very good job of that since earlier this year. They did it at the NATO summit in The Hague. They laid the groundwork for making sure that President Trump got some of the outcomes that he was aiming for. And I think they're playing a very constructive role in keeping the White House within certain parameters in order to ensure that we don't have a complete break between President Trump and President Zelensky, and Putin is not left standing there alone influencing President Trump, because that is what Putin has been aiming at. So you're seeing sort of a team approach to diplomacy, where Europe is actually helping to keep the United States, maybe not on the straight and narrow, but at least a little more straight and a little more narrow than otherwise would be the case.
The economic forecast is in. It's not looking great for the American consumer. In July, costs for producers and manufacturers, known as wholesale inflation, rose at the fastest monthly pace since June of 2022, when we were in the pandemic. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the Producer Price Index, which measures inflation before it hits consumers, jumped 0.9% from June to July. That's the biggest monthly jump in over 3 years. It's more than 4 times what economists expected. Now, higher prices may be hitting American consumers next. So far, consumer prices have been relatively steady. Now, this is partly due to U.S. importers bearing the brunt of some of these costs, even taking steps to offset the impact by pre-ordering inventory and absorbing some of the tariffs to shield consumers. But unfortunately, that buffer between the tariffs and your wallet may not last. Let's take a step back and break this all down. There are 2 kinds of inflation that we measure on a monthly basis. Retail inflation, which is what you, the consumer, feels, and wholesale inflation. Wholesale inflation is the change in prices that businesses pay for goods. So manufacturers, producers, and business owners tend to feel wholesale inflation first before the goods even get into your hands. Costs go up for them, and then they're forced to make some pretty tough decisions. Do they and can they pass the price hike on to you as the consumer? Do they or can they squeeze their suppliers and manufacturers? In almost all cases, the impact eventually makes it to the checkout line, causing you to pay higher retail prices. But President Trump doesn't seem to believe there's any cause to worry.
We had the worst inflation in the history of our country, and now our inflation is down to a perfect number, a beautiful number, hardly any at all. And yet our country is taking in tens of billions of dollars and trillions of dollars, actually trillions of dollars in tariffs. You know all about it. It's been amazing. They say, why are we taking in so much money?
Okay, I mean, one can get exhausted doing this, but we're just going to point out lies where we can. We've not taken trillions of dollars in tariffs. It is in the billions, there's no question, but there's no reason to lie about that. Just say the number. Joining me now is Justin Wolfers, the professor of economics and public policy at the University of Michigan. He's the host of the Think Like an Economist podcast. He's the co-author of the book Principles in Economics with another famous and terrific economist, Betsy Stevenson. Justin, great to see you. Thank you for being with us. This is a great moment, because normally you see these things move in slightly tighter lockstep in wholesale inflation and consumer inflation. We're not seeing that, so it's important. This is a great opportunity to point out. We now have wholesale inflation at a much higher number than we expected, and now the question becomes, what happens next? Because most of us don't buy things wholesale, we buy things retail.
Yeah, absolutely. So the producer price index is all about what happens to the stuff businesses buy. The consumer price index, the C there, consumer, is the stuff you and I buy. And of course, you and I buy stuff from producers. So think about this as the snake that swallowed the inflationary rat. We're seeing it halfway along the snake, and there's a big bulge in the snake right now. So one question, I guess, is whether the snake can just digest that enormous rat stuck halfway through, or is he going to poop it out the end? I'm getting a bit graphic here, as the sort of consumer price inflation that you and I will see. My guess, for what it's worth, is usually when you swallow too big of a rat, something comes out the other end and consumers end up getting hurt.
So Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, was on Morning Joe recently, and he was asked the question very directly, who pays for the tariffs? Listen to what he said.
Who pays the tariffs is a choice, and what we've seen thus far is that the manufacturers are eating a substantial portion of the tariffs and taking it into their profit margins.
So just when Donald Trump is lying about trillions, that's a lie. This is not a lie. He's making an interesting point. It's a choice, but it's not your and my choice, Justin. It may be the choice of a major retailer who can afford to squeeze, the manufacturer, or can afford to take a little bit of a profit cut to absorb the money. It's not a choice for you and me. Someone else will make the decision if a tariff is paid as to whether you and I are paying it.
Wouldn't it be wonderful if it was a choice? I'd just walk in and I'd say, you know what? Didn't vote for the guy. I'm not paying the tariff. I'll take the discount price and the rest of you schmucks can pay more.
Right.
But no, that's not how it works. So, look, I just want to be really clear because Bessent actually was trying to use a bunch of cowardly language to not be as clear as he could. Here's how it works. If Best Buy imports a washing machine from abroad, say from Korea, it hits the docks in America. And, Best Buy will have paid some price for it. At this point, Best Buy can only get that washer out of customs if Best Buy pays the tariff.
Correct.
That's it. They're going to have to pay $100 to get it out. So at a literal level, Best Buy sends the check on. Now, economists don't look at what's literal. We then say, well, how does everything get connected here? So there are actually 4 possible things that could happen. The first is, in order to maintain market share, Samsung could cut the price they charge Americans. Turns out we have very good data on that. It's called the Import Price Index. Yep. The Import Price Index hasn't fallen a penny, which means foreign companies aren't bearing a penny of the imports. Second thing that could happen is Best Buy could pay the extra $100 and then it could jack up its price to consumers by $100. Best Buy comes out okay. We've seen a little bit of that, but not very much. So that tells us it must be the third thing. And the third thing is Best Buy's margins get compressed. And this is why you've heard things like Ford talking about $1 billion write-off for tariffs. You've heard the same thing from General Motors, and you're hearing it throughout earnings season. The only other thing that can happen is they just stop sending washing machines, in which case the consumer goes without, but it doesn't show up in our statistics. So the important point to realize here is foreigners are paying 0 of our tariffs. At the moment, the battle is between will it be companies that pay them, but those are companies owned by Americans, or will it be you and I who pay them at the store? Again, you and I are Americans, but there's no doubt Americans are paying the tariffs at this point.
Yeah, and what we haven't got a chance to talk to, but we'll talk about next time is we're talking about Best Buy, which may have some leverage and ability to do that. There are a whole lot of small businesses who have no control over this situation whatsoever. Absolutely. And you're going to start seeing more of them going out of business because there's nothing they can do about it. Justin, thanks as always. Justin Wolfers is a professor of economics and public policy at the University of Michigan. All right, coming up, as Republicans... I grew up in Toronto, and I remember when I was about 10 years old, my class went on a field trip to the Art Gallery of Ontario. The big exhibit at the time was King Tut and the history of ancient Egypt. At the time, it was literally the coolest thing I had ever seen. My mind was blown, and to this day, I will never forget that. And I'm sure many of you, your children, your grandchildren, have had similarly amazing experiences at a museum. For everyday people like us, especially young kids, museums are the most accessible places to learn about history of all kinds, history to which you may otherwise not be exposed. All you need is a ticket, and many museums are free. They're places of knowledge and wonder. According to the American Alliance of Museums, 97% of Americans believe museums are educational assets for their communities. 92% of adults in this country say museums are nonpartisan providers of educational content. 3/4 of the American public believe museums are an important part of our civil society and have a role in supporting civic knowledge and participation. And while American history books have often told stories of the victor over the vanquished, museums and other nonpartisan institutions have worked hard to try and get it right over the years, to try and tell the whole truth. It hasn't always succeeded, but they seem to be on an onward mission to do this. The Smithsonian Institution, which defines itself as the world's largest museum, education, and research complex, is one of the best examples of this. Through exhibits at its 21 museums, 14 education and research centers, and the National Zoo, the Smithsonian has put on display decades of research and curated American history at the highest possible standard, largely without government interference. That is until now. Earlier this week, the White House announced that it's going to conduct a, quote, comprehensive internal review of selected Smithsonian museums and exhibitions, and that, quote, this initiative aims to ensure alignment with the president's directive to celebrate American exceptionalism, remove divisive or partisan narratives, and restore confidence in our shared cultural institutions, end quote. By the way, this is an internal review, not like a public discussion or hearings or things like that, an internal White House review. And anything that doesn't align with Donald Trump's vision of America will be regarded as so-called improper ideology and removed. Just let that sit with you for a second. The White House will decide what is improper ideology. The administration's first plan is to tackle 8 Smithsonian museums, including the National Museum of American History, the National Museum of African American History and Culture, the National Museum of the American Indian, and the National Portrait Gallery. Additional museums will be targeted in a second phase to be announced later. Trump first took aim at the Smithsonian back in March when he signed an executive order claiming that, quote, the Smithsonian has in recent years come under the influence of a divisive race-centered ideology, end quote. And as such, he's directed Vice President J.D. Vance, who's a member of the Smithsonian's Board of Regents, to remove improper ideology from such properties and make recommendations to Trump on how to decenter race in these spaces. Plain and simple, it's a war on history. Not the history of any one group, but our collective history, as we've learned. Hadar Harris, managing director of the Freedom of Expression Group at PEN America, summed it up this way, quote, the administration's efforts to rewrite history are a betrayal of our democratic traditions and a deeply concerning effort to strip truth from the institutions that tell our national story, from the Smithsonian to our national parks. Understanding our nation's past is critical for us to be able to navigate our nation's future. And right now, all of that is in jeopardy. Joining me now is Pulitzer Prize-winning historian Jon Meacham. He's the Rogers Chair in the American Presidency at Vanderbilt University and an MSNBC political analyst. Jon, it is great to see you. I think this is kind of remarkable. The telling of history in its fullness is what you do for a living, and it's something advanced cultures have come to appreciate, right? That history is beautiful and ugly and complicated and tough and scarred, and we will not learn unless we learn all of it.
History is a divisive narrative. And that's the interesting part of the president's letter, is he says he wants to remove partisan narratives, and we can talk about that, but divisive narratives. Everything's a divisive narrative in American history because it's a human undertaking where we have a battle between, I would argue, what Abraham Lincoln called our better angels and our worst instincts. And part of the majesty and the brilliance of the American founding was that it recognized that we were human, that we were fallen, we were frail, we were fallible. In many ways, the Constitution, I'd argue, is as theological a document as it is a legal document. The reason they made it so hard for us to do anything is because they assumed that most of what we would want to do would be bad. And we've now done everything we can to prove them right through the years. So you're exactly right. We just have to tell the whole story. Now, that doesn't mean that the prevailing narratives of a given set of historians or set of folks is somehow perfect. History is, as I would argue, is as much an art as it is a science. It is a matter of opinion. What do you emphasize? What do you minimize?
Well, what you do in your books as well, right? It is still curation, right? You don't, even when you write because your books are really big and detailed, and still lots of stuff gets left out. I mean that with love.
Yeah. I will say this. My colleague Doris Kearns Goodwin once got a note from a woman who was reading her book on William Howard Taft and Theodore Roosevelt and said it had broken her nose because she had been reading it and then fell asleep. So I have not actually harmed anyone, unlike Doris. Okay, I want that on the record.
So
sure,
noted.
I'm doing this. I'm in the middle of writing a biography of Dwight Eisenhower, the man who ratified an American consensus between the New Deal and conservatism under what President Reagan really embodied. And absolutely, you have to you make choices. That's what museums do. That's what biographers do. That's what journalists do. Guess what? That's what voters and citizens do.
Yep.
And so what this required is not a one-size-fits-all. And again, right. I'm not saying that the institutions are perfect. I'm sure there's something that can be made better. And by the way, some years ago, I was on the board of the National History Museum, American History Museum at the Smithsonian. And I think they'd be the first people to say, do they get everything right? No. But let's just call it as we see it. President Trump did not wake up one morning and decide that he wanted to become the Edward Gibbon of America and make a decision about American history. This is part of the project of remaking the country in his image.
Right. And so there are two really important parts to that. One is that I think you've pointed out well that museums should evolve, they should discuss, they should review, and that should be left to curators and experts and maybe outside people and people like you to say, hey, have we gotten this right? Because if you walk into any museum today compared to 50 or 100 years ago, things will be told differently, as well they should. The problem is this concept of alignment with something. That's what worried me. Even the language that the White House used. First of all, it's an internal review, not a public review or a review of the nation's best historians and curators. But this alignment concept worries me a lot, because these days, all these things that sound a little authoritarian set off alarm bells in my head.
And rightly, you're exactly right to be underscoring this, I think. And you're also exactly right in your setup about the remarkable place the Smithsonian holds in American culture. The Museum of African American History and Culture is an extraordinary achievement. I defy anyone to stand at that lunch counter and not feel the weight and the pain and, yes, the ultimate goodness of the American experiment. But guess what? That goodness is contingent. And so the reason you stand at the lunch counter, where in 1960, incredibly brave, nonviolent activists bore witness against a system of segregation, is you stand there to remind yourself of what to do, and Lord knows what not to do. And so is that an alignment? Is recognizing a national mistake and then talking about its rectification and its the ongoing need for attention and care, is that in alignment? That's where you get into a you get on a very, very slippery slope.
Do you ever think about this as you're writing about people whom maybe you chose to write about because you admire, or you admire some of their successes, and you realize there's dirty laundry, and that's part of the story, right? The fact that there's dirty laundry and then it got washed is part of the story.
That is entirely the story. That is entirely the story. It is all of my. You've already made a mistake here. You've asked for my theory of biography. So very briefly, to me, it's not that people are heroic. It's that flawed people got one or two things right. And isn't that amazing?
Wow.
Now, most people are better than I am. That's not hard, so don't get cocky. But I know that if I do the right thing 51% of the time, that's a hell of a good day. And I don't have that many of those. And so the remarkable thing about Abraham Lincoln is that he ran for the Senate in 1858, and in Southern Illinois, he said blacks should not be on juries. They should not intermarry with white people. He was not for the full rights of citizenship. And yet, in the crucible of what he called the fiery trial, he got to emancipation. Now, his critics on what we would call the left thought it was too slow. His critics on what we would call the right said it was too fast. But he got there. He got there because of the power and the courage of enslaved people who fled the lines and all that. But that's the key. Right. Thomas Jefferson, slave owner, absolute embodiment of what we got wrong, what people like me, white Southern Protestants, got wrong for a long time, still wrote the most important sentence arguably ever originally rendered in English, that all men are created equal. And as my colleague Annette Gordon-Reed of Harvard says, what do you want from one guy? Right? He writes the Declaration of Independence and we hold him to account for everything else. Absolutely. But how many of us have written the Declaration of Independence?
Right.
So the reason to tell these stories, I believe, is not, again, to put people on a pedestal to worship. It's to put them on a pedestal so more people can see them.
Let's bring in Peter Baker, MSNBC political analyst and chief White House correspondent for the New York Times, and MSNBC international affairs analyst and former U.S. ambassador to Russia, Michael McFaul. Ambassador, thank you for being here in studio. You get the first question. Anything that Vaughn reported there, does that stand out to you as unique, interesting? What comes to mind?
Well, I think it's a good thing that they're talking about security guarantees. That was not talked about with Putin. President Trump for a long time has not talked about that. I think that format of Zelensky with the European leaders, I think that's a good one. So it's not just Zelensky and Trump. We've known what's happened with that from time to time. So that's good news. But the devil's in the details. When Vaughn kept saying NATO-like security guarantees, why not just NATO security guarantees? So this notion that it's going to be something like NATO but less than NATO, if I were the Ukrainians, that would make me nervous. They had one of those, by the way, in 1994. It was called the Budapest Memorandum, and it meant nothing. It didn't stop Putin from invading in 2014. It didn't stop him from launching his full-scale invasion in 2022. So good news, they're talking about something that's a necessary part of a long-term, credible end of this war, but the bad news is that it's something NATO light, when in my view it should be NATO. To me, that's the way to real credible security guarantee is membership in NATO.
So, Peter, you're still there in Alaska. You're wrapping up the reporting. Beyond learning President Zelensky is expected in D.C. on Monday, what more have we learned about the actual meeting between Trump and Putin, and anything verifiable or behind the scenes to report from either side?
Well, look, what we've learned, especially in the hours this morning, is that the president gave up his demand for a ceasefire. Remember, what we're talking about now, when we talk about security guarantees and so forth, this meeting with Zelensky, this is for a broader peace agreement that would be more enduring down the road. But that's not going to happen overnight. That's going to take a long time. You heard President Putin say, I was in the room with him yesterday, he said we have to address the root causes. When President Putin uses the phrase root causes, what he means by that is NATO retreating back to its 1997 border before its expansion. What it means is Kyiv giving up a lot of its military. What it means is Kyiv giving up a lot of its territory. These are not things that are going to happen overnight. What President Trump came into Alaska saying he wanted was an immediate ceasefire to halt the killing right away. And then he left Alaska not only without that ceasefire, but giving up on it. A complete reversal in just a few hours of time, the kind of which we don't normally see in international diplomacy. And that means that what Vladimir Putin got out of this summit meeting is not only the nice photo op on the red carpet and in the presidential limousine. What he got out of it was essentially a free pass to continue the war for an indefinite amount of time without the severe consequences that Trump said he would impose if there wasn't a ceasefire.
Ambassador, I want to add, Axios is reporting a difficult phone call post-summit with Zelensky. How do you interpret these developments, and are you hearing anything from Ukraine?
Well, I think Peter's absolutely right that Putin won the framing of the negotiations and what comes next, and Trump just gave up really quickly. Shockingly so. It kind of reminds me of Helsinki when he just accepted Putin's point of view about what happened in the 2016 elections. And that creates problems for Zelensky, because Zelensky, the list of things that Peter just listed, that's not going to happen, not anytime soon. I would say not anytime ever. The idea that Ukraine, President Zelensky, is going to unilaterally leave positions in Donbass that his soldiers are in right now, that sounds absurd to me. Putin has been trying to conquer Donbass since 2014 and has failed. And now he's trying to get Trump to help him to do that. And so the idea that they're going to negotiate over that the Ukrainians are going to leave territory that they're currently in exchange for a ceasefire, that just seems completely untenable to me and suggests to me that this negotiation is going to be long and tragically probably not very successful.
Peter, Trump spoke to Fox News after the Putin meeting, and the Times headline reads, after summit, Trump heaps praise on Putin in Fox News interview. What struck you from that interview? Anything concerning or illuminating?
Well, what Trump said in that interview when he praised Putin was really that Putin praised him. That's what he was focused on. He brought up with Hannity, without being asked, how happy he was to hear Vladimir Putin say in their public appearance that he agreed with Trump's longstanding assertion that the invasion of Ukraine, the full-fledged invasion of Ukraine in 2022, wouldn't have happened had Trump still been president. That was just music to Trump's ears. He also said, whether this is actually true or not, we don't know because it happened behind closed doors, but he said that Putin agreed with him that the election in 2020 had been rigged. He agreed with him on all of these grievances that Trump has articulated over the years. In other words, Putin, who is a former KGB officer who used to be in charge of managing, foreign assets, was playing to put Trump's own sensibilities. And that's by Trump's own description in that interview.
So can I ask you, Peter, why no questions after the meeting? I mean, is it because maybe Putin didn't want to face tough questions from the U.S. media and so Trump complied?
That's a really good question because it was advertised as a news conference, and that was not a news conference. What it was two statements meant, offered seriatim, one after the other. In fact, what was really odd about it was that President Trump, who was the host of this meeting, let President Putin go first. That's not the protocol, as Mike McFaul, of course, as an ambassador to Russia, knows quite well. And by allowing Putin to be the first to speak, he got to frame, the meetings that they had just had. And they took no questions. Now, it wouldn't be surprising if the Russians said they didn't want to take questions, but it was a tell that President Trump didn't take questions, because even if he didn't take questions with Putin at his side, it would normally be the kind of thing he might do where he would talk to the reporters on the plane or talk to reporters separately or whatever. The fact that he didn't, when he usually likes to talk to reporters and success and victory suggests that perhaps he wasn't comfortable doing that. It's really not clear. The only person he did talk to was Sean Hannity, who, of course, is supportive of him. And I think that was an interesting moment.
So, Michael, getting back to the no ceasefire, let's work toward a peace agreement aspect of this whole deal. It seems to be a gift to Putin, right? There's no immediate further sanctions. It lets Putin keep on with his military assault of Ukraine.
Yes.
So in that measurement, the meeting is a failure, right? I mean, it's not a 10 out of 10, as the president claimed. How do you see it?
Well, it's definitely not, in my view, a 10 out of 10, both in the symbolism and the substance. So the symbolism for me was just outrageous. This is an indicted war criminal that came to the United States of America. This is the guy that for the first time since Hitler and Stalin launched a full-scale invasion of a European country, complete with occupation and annexation. This is a guy that has kidnapped thousands of Ukrainian children. This is a guy who bombs every night, terrorizes civilians in Ukraine, and kills them every single night. That is not a person that you should roll out the red carpet to. And the fact that Trump just treats him as his friend is a real setback for America's reputation in the world as the leader of the free world that has implications way beyond Ukraine. But then secondly, on the substance, I've organized meetings like this.
Yep.
I worked for President Obama. I've organized summits many times. And summits are about deliverables. What do we get out of the meeting? And usually the Secretary of State, National Security Advisor, people like me do the homework first. And then at the meeting, there's something tangible that makes the American people better off. This had no deliverables. Zero deliverables in terms of that. And the ones that even Trump himself set, ceasefire, as Peter mentioned, one was just, when he kept lowering the bar, he's like, well, I hope I can announce a new meeting, a trilateral meeting. He couldn't even do that. And so it begs the question, what was the purpose of the meeting? And what did we, the American people, get out of this meeting? I would say right now we got nothing.
You've been in this room with Putin. What is it about Putin and the people around him? Is it that he is so mesmerizing or transfixing on the topics? Or in this case, relative to Donald Trump, is it that he is so susceptible to flattery? What is it that makes the outcome that we get?
So I think it's both. Putin is a formidable interlocutor. He comes very prepared for these meetings. He knows what his goals are, and he's never in a hurry to get to those goals. This is a big difference that I always noticed in negotiating with Russians. We Americans were kind of in a hurry. We have a problem. We're engineers. We got to get it done. He doesn't think that way. He thinks time is on his side. And by the way, he may be right about that.
Yeah.
But the second piece is that when I look at the way President Trump thinks about these meetings, he thinks the meeting itself is the end. And so it's a good meeting. It's always a good meeting. It's never a bad meeting. We had a good meeting, 10 out of 10. That's the deliverable for him. Whereas for Putin, he doesn't see it that way. He doesn't need the meeting to go well. He needs Trump to be his ally to help rehabilitate him as a leader on the great power stage. And that's exactly what happened. And he understands that to do that, you flatter Trump. So all this nonsense about 2020 and mail-in ballots, how absurd is that to be talking about at a summit about trying to end the war in Ukraine? Yet he rolled that out because he knows that that's what Trump wants to hear. He rolls out this absurd claim that I wouldn't have invaded had you been president. And yet again,
where's the proof on that?
That's a talking point. There's no proof.
None.
By the way, there's no proof about the mail-in ballots not working either.
By the way, right.
But that he knows those are talking points that Trump uses, and sure enough, in his meeting with Hannity, those are the things he's repeating.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the weekend primetime. It is nice to be back here with you guys. I feel
Good to see you.
It's nice to be back. I was going to say, I take off a few weeks and I come back and I hardly recognize what is happening in this country. Vladimir Putin is getting a red carpet treatment. Cities are being taken over. And it seems a lot has changed in just a couple of weeks.
Usually the summertime is a slow news time, and yet here we are. You come back to the chair with a new world.
Yeah, I was going to say August is usually the time where people like to duck out of D.C. or New York, and you think things are
now part of the story is actually politicians trying to duck out of D.C. and avoid. I mean,
Ted Cruz is going to Cancun again?
Not quite.
Who knows where that man is? I do not know. But between Epstein, developments overseas, this summit, we were missing you, Eamon.
Well,
we gave you a shout out a few times.
I appreciate that. Thank you. No, I was going to say, I was overseas. I was in Europe. I was in the Middle East. And it's always interesting when you travel abroad to see how the world is reacting, what is happening to the U.S. I was actually surprised. I had some friends of mine who come to the U.S. regularly, and they were telling me that they did not want to come to the U.S. while Trump was in office out of the fear of what was happening to people at the airports, to just the policies that were being enacted. People didn't want to make their social media public for the government to go through with it. And so you get a sense that, we sometimes think we live in a bubble, but the world is watching what is happening here in America. And certainly with the Trump and Putin meeting, it has taken on a whole new level of interest abroad.
I feel very much so like we are in an episode of The Emperor's Clothing.
Right.
In the sense that the way that we are given a narrative, if you will, around things, and I think that Alaska is a perfect example, is not the way the rest of the world is looking at us.
Yeah.
And I find, even this narrative of, your president is a great deal maker. Your president is someone who is the master of the deal. Only to himself. I mean, and what I mean by that is the rest of the world is looking at him and at the alleged deals, and it's kind of sort of like, well, if something I say often, if I say I'm Superman enough, eventually someone will believe I can fly.
Right.
And I think that's just sort of like how the rest of the world is looking at, like, this guy keeps claiming that he's the master of the deal, but we've yet to actually see it take place.
Well, to that point, I think one of the lessons I've learned as a reporter and just a person living in this country the last several weeks has been to look very closely at the clues, the images, the posters, the propaganda, and of course the actions of this administration, more so than the words. Because a lot of what I've taken from this summit has been things like the red carpet.
Yes.
The way in which Putin was invited into the beast.
Yeah.
Into the
Trump
president's
clapping
car.
for him while he was
Yes, they're incredibly friendly, the smiles. And then even at the presser that Putin spoke first.
Yeah.
All of these, I think those pieces matter more than the fact that we really didn't learn that much about any kind of deal. There is no deal right now. The path ahead is still incredibly uncertain. When I think about what's happening in D.C., it's one thing to hear what the administration claims this is all about. It's another thing to watch it unfold, to see videos, photos taken by the people who actually live there and are going out on the streets reacting to and experiencing all of this. Then I think about all of our conversations the last couple of weeks around immigration and the actions of ICE and the propaganda coming out of the Department of Homeland Security right now. You can learn a lot about our federal government just from the posters, the recruitment posters that they're spreading everywhere. Again, more so than what they say when they do hits on Fox News.
Right.
And so looking at the symbols, the images, that's been the lesson for me as a reporter to kind of help me connect all the dots and really get to what this story is about.
The word propaganda is very interesting because the messaging that is coming out of this administration with posts on social media, with the way they're trying to recruit people to ICE, with the way that they're trying to conjure up a return back to a certain type of the United States decades ago. I think people are looking at that. And again, just briefly from my experience overseas, people are looking at that with a great degree of alarm and shock that America is trying to invoke this type of imagery. But at the same time, people are looking at America and it has definitely fallen in its stature among the eyes of ordinary people when they see a lot of what you were talking about with Vladimir Putin, with, the propaganda that they're pushing out there.
I think the most important thing about everything that we're saying, without trying to bring your vacation to a somber end, is the importance in this moment of truth-telling. Because in terms of the competing narratives and what they will mean for history, what matters most is getting the story and the facts correct. Because that's what we will remember. And as we will discuss through the many stories that we're dealing with today, the attack on history, on culture, and on narrative is on full-fledged and in full swing. So we've got our work cut out for us.
We are going to discuss all of those and much more. It's great to be back with you guys, and thank you so much for joining in. But let's talk a little bit about the expectations versus reality that we were just having this conversation with here. So we learned Donald Trump will host Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky on Monday at the White House. This, of course, comes after he failed to deliver on a ceasefire or, quite honestly, any concrete deal during his meeting with Vladimir Putin yesterday. Now, overall, the expectations going into this meeting were really destroyed by reality, and we can break that down for you. One expectation, Trump and Putin would meet for at least 6 to 7 hours. And in reality, that did not happen. The whole visit lasted about 4.5 hours. They did get some alone time, spending at least 10 minutes together in the presidential limo, also known as the Beast. That happened without any interpreters. Now, another expectation was that they would hold an actual press conference, the one where you ask questions of these leaders. Instead, we got 12 minutes of remarks, 0 questions taken from any member of the press, Russian or American. And lastly, Trump built an expectation that he'd be angry if a ceasefire wasn't reached. Instead, the word ceasefire did not come up once during their public remarks. And now the president is dropping his ceasefire demands altogether and instead calling for a peace deal. This, as senior administration officials confirmed that Putin, Zelensky, and European leaders spoke on the phone today about the U.S. being party to a potential NATO-like security guarantee for Ukraine. The letdown as Russia's war rages on in Ukraine comes after Trump himself wavered on expectations after calling the stakes high. Now, here's how he predicted it would all go down. Take a listen.
Could be a good meeting, and we'll go a step further. We'll get it done. I'd like to see a ceasefire very, very quickly. Very quickly.
President, will Russia face any consequences if Vladimir Putin does not agree to stop the war after your meeting on Friday?
Yes, they will. Yeah.
What will those consequences
There will be
be?
consequences.
Sanctions, tariffs?
There will be, I don't have to say, there will be very severe consequences. All I want to do is set the table for the next meeting, which should happen shortly.
I'm going to have a press conference. I don't know if it's going to be a joint. We haven't even discussed it. I think it might be nice to have a joint and then separate.
I want to see a ceasefire rapidly. I don't know if it's going to be today, but I'm not going to be happy if it's not today. There were many, many points that we agreed on, most of them, I would say, a couple of big ones that we haven't quite gotten there, but we've made some headway. So there's no deal until there's a deal.
Joining us now, former U.S. Ambassador to Russia and MSNBC International Affairs analyst, Ambassador Michael McFaul. Ambassador, it's great to be with you. I know it's been a long 24 hours for you, with little to talk about, but also a lot to try to analyze, right? Because we're trying to make sense of what has happened, when in reality, very little actually came out of that meeting publicly. We are getting some insights into now this idea that President Trump wants to go for a big deal, a peace deal, an all-encompassing type of deal. We don't even know what that means. But just give me your read over the past 24 hours in terms of how this has played out and where you see things going from here.
So first on what just happened over the last 48 hours, we, the President of the United States, not we, invited to our country a dictator. That sometimes happens. But this one's an indicted war criminal, so that doesn't happen hardly ever. This is a guy that kidnaps children from Ukraine and tries to make them into Russians. He bombs civilians, friends of mine in Ukraine, every single night and kills them. That's called terrorism, usually. And against that backdrop, the President of the United States, the most powerful person in the world, decided to have a meeting with him and then decided to invite him to the United States of America. He didn't have to do that. And then, you're showing it, rolled out literally a red carpet for him. And I just think no matter what happened, you don't have to do that. Yes, in diplomacy, we have to deal with autocrats. I did when I worked for President Obama. But you don't have to check your values at the door. And this felt like that. Some would say, they would say, Mike, you know, you're so obsessed with democracy versus dictatorship. It's all about transactions. It's all about getting deals done, right? Art of the deal. Well, that's our president.
He's trying to make peace.
He's trying to get a deal done. He's trying to, in the language of diplomacy, a deliverable. But you just played a series of sound bites. All of the things he promised to do, he accomplished none of them. Ceasefire didn't happen. A trilateral meeting didn't happen. Even a modicum of some kind of incremental progress, they couldn't announce at a press conference, so they canceled the press conference. They had a Soviet-style press conference, right? And I've organized these meetings. I've organized 3 or 4 of these kinds of meetings when I worked for President Obama. It is highly unusual to actually have a menu printed out and then decide, well, let's just skip that. That suggests to me that, okay, maybe all this stuff could have led to a good outcome, but it didn't lead to a deal. I hope it does in the future. I wish President Zelensky well on Monday, but we didn't have to do all of that for what little that we got out of it.
Can I ask you what you thought, and then also what you think our allies, the Europeans, what Zelensky may have thought by some of the visuals, the pomp, the circumstance? You spelled out the red carpet, but also the invitation into the beast.
Yes.
The way the two of them were smiling in the back of the car. The fact that Putin spoke first at that strange press conference.
Yeah.
All things that I don't know. I guess I wouldn't expect for an American president to allow to unfold on our soil with someone like Putin. How bizarre and abnormal was all of this? And how do you think it's being seen by the rest of the world?
Well, from my perspective, it was highly abnormal. I want to be clear. It's unusual. All the stuff you just saw doesn't even happen for our Democratic allies. How many times have you seen any of our Democratic allies, our NATO allies, or allies in Asia treated like that? It doesn't even happen for our partners and allies.
Well, some of our allies are actually afraid to visit the Oval Office right now.
Well, there's that problem, too. But that's my reaction. I can tell you the reaction of Ukrainians was deep disappointment. They're tired of this war. They want some hope. They placed their bets in the President of the United States that could he finally get a ceasefire? Could we finally sleep through the night, as one of my friends said? And so the fact that he treated him this way with no results was deeply disappointing. Now, you're not going to hear that from President Zelensky because he has no choice. He has to go meet with President Trump. He has to try to reframe this narrative. You're talking about narratives. Trump just basically accepted Putin's narrative about everything, as far as the reporting that we're hearing about what they actually talked about. So now Zelensky has to try to change that narrative, try to change the frame. He has no choice. But is he disappointed? I think there's no doubt.
Ambassador, there seems to be an integrity gap that exists between, we're talking about narrative, the narrative that is being parroted through talking points from the White House and others and the administration, and then what we're actually seeing and what we're actually witnessing. Yes. The two aren't adding up. The more that the president continues to sort of step forward with this strongman image, which is understandable, it's something that he has to do, but without actually delivering, how much does that compromise whatever leverage he may have on the international stage in terms of other conflicts that may be going on, and his ability to sort of mediate where people look at them and say, we can't take you seriously. You tried that tough talk over here, and Putin was sort of playing you for a fool, and you come over here in whatever conflict you may want to sort of insert yourself, and you have no leverage to insert. So how much does this do to damage whatever leverage he may have on the international stage and other spaces?
That's a great question. I don't think we ask that question enough. We think it's just about Putin, but it's not. And he didn't talk tough. He didn't do anything tough. Let's just be clear about that. He was acquiescent. He was expressing his admiration for Putin. And he thinks somehow, I'm guessing, I haven't talked to President Trump about this personally, but somehow doing this shows respect. But I've dealt with Putin. What he sees is weakness. When he doesn't have to do anything to get that kind of treatment, that in his eyes makes Trump look weak. And I think it makes him look weak all around the world. I think when Xi Jinping's looking at this, he's saying this is the way he treats people that invade countries, invade other places. Well, there is not a great cost to it. And I just think it damages our reputation more generally, as maybe we don't have this mantle anymore. I need to be sober about this. But for decades, the United States was considered the leader of the free world, the democratic world. We met with autocrats and dictators, but we didn't treat them this way. Trump is just giving that away. He doesn't even think in those terms, right? He literally does not think in terms of autocrats versus Democrats. And I think that hurts America's long-term national security interest well beyond President Trump.
So when you look at this meeting from a Russian perspective, and I'm going to ask you to, I mean, you certainly know Vladimir Putin more than most. When you go back to Inauguration Day and the fact that you had President Trump saying he was going to end this war in 24 hours, try to make a ceasefire deal, ultimately Putin rejected that. Trump basically begging him on X to stop the killing. Right. Remember when he was going, Vlad, stop, and that didn't happen. He didn't get him to stop the war. He didn't get a ceasefire. He wasn't able to get him to any kind of an agreement, not even to create some kind of mechanism of diplomacy, of regularly scheduled talks. He berated Volodymyr Zelensky. Vladimir Putin gets a red carpet treatment. What does Vladimir Putin think he has achieved over the last 6 months with Donald Trump in office?
Oh, fantastic successes. Yeah. The propagandists on Russian TV that work for him, I watch them so you don't have to. They are elated. This is beyond their wildest imagination. They thought there was going to be some tough talk. They thought there was going to be some pressure, right? Diplomacy is about, with autocrats, is about pressure and negotiation. This has all been on the latter side, no pressure. And moreover, Putin basically at that press conference hinted the same exact talking points that he's had since 2022. He has not moved his position on Ukraine one tiny inch, and he's paid no price for not moving, at least so far. And I would go back further. I was trying to think of a time when, with all of this engagement, with all this friendship and the clapping when he comes up, that President Trump has done both in his first term and now in his second term. Is there one tangible thing that the American people have gotten out of all of that? Are we more secure? Are we wealthier? Are we defending our values better? I can't think of one deliverable, as we used to say in the State Department, that we've achieved from that strategy. So I hope he changes his strategy, because this strategy is not working.
Can I ask you very quickly before we have to go to break? A lot of the press corps that was there, they reported in the minutes and hours after the presser that they saw members of the administration like Carolyn Leavitt look ashen, almost frightened after what they had seen behind closed doors. What did that indicate to you?
Well, first, we should all be glad that we did not go to Alaska, because I was in Helsinki with you and I was in Geneva when President Biden met. They traveled a long ways for nothing in return, those journalists, right? But that suggests to me that this was a bigger disaster than they're leading on. To your point, they're trying to spin it, although they're not even trying to spin it. That's a really interesting thing. When I worked at the White House and we would have meetings like this, I was the SAO, the senior administration official that would call up journalists, that would call the New York Times to say, this is what was discussed, to push it this way. They're not even attempting to do that because they know they don't have anything to work with.